9,400,000 square kilometers of scorching sand define the Sahara, the largest and most thermal desert on the planet. This territory has long functioned as a final frontier for life, where advancing dunes bury vegetation and steadily erode human hope for cultivation. Why would anyone consider introducing bees to such a hostile environment? At first glance, the idea seems simple, but in reality, these tiny agents of the ecosystem were proposed as a singular ray of hope for one of Africa's harshest landscapes. But without an existing floral foundation, the insects have no means of survival, and the plan immediately faces a physical wall. Bees cannot create water and possess no biological mechanism to turn dry sand into fertile soil. One can notice how the heat-resistant insects only return to a region once the underlying ecological foundation has already been repaired through mechanical means. The process is only gaining momentum. Humanity was forced to seek a more fundamental technical approach that begins not with the introduction of species or greenery, but with the physical manipulation of land and water. This realization served as the catalyst for the birth of Africa's Great Green Wall. It only looks obvious to plant trees in a straight line, but in reality, the project requires complex crescent-shaped earthworks designed to catch every drop of rare rainfall. These structures act as manual hydraulic systems, slowing down the movement of water so it can penetrate the parched crust. The camera glides along the vast perimeter of this construction, where thousands of kilometers of terrain are being reshaped. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale of the effort increases. 10 million hectares of land are targeted for restoration in a transformation that represents one of the largest ecosystem engineering efforts ever undertaken by humankind. The equipment moves slowly across the horizon, carving out the basins that will eventually hold life. Transition to the next level. This journey from fragile biological experiments to massive earth-moving operations marks a shift toward heavy industrial restoration. The foundation is laid for a change that will span the entire width of the continent. Molten heat still dominates the atmosphere, but the physical restructuring of the desert floor has finally commenced. 9 million square kilometers of the Sahara represent a shifting geological system rather than a static, frozen landscape. Why has the southern edge of this desert steadily advanced into the Sahel over the past 100 years? It seems simple to blame the climate, but the land where generations of people once farmed and grazed livestock has lost its internal resilience. This transition is not a sudden occurrence, but a systematic dismantling of the environment. The process is only gaining momentum. Landscapes that previously supported various shrubs and dense grasses have transformed into bare, cracked surfaces. One can notice how the soil loses its physical structure as the sparse vegetation vanishes. At first glance, the encroachment of the desert is about the movement of dunes, but in reality, the most critical factor is the total disappearance of transitional ecological layers. Without a protective cover of plants, the ground is exposed to the elements. Rainwater no longer infiltrates the parched earth, and it is visible how each seasonal downpour washes away the remaining fragments of the biological foundation. This lack of moisture absorption prevents the ecosystem from regaining a foothold. Everything only gets more complicated as the slow draining of life continues until the soil reaches a point of no return. Desertification does not manifest as a dramatic collapse, but as a persistent erosion of the land's ability to recover on its own. It is visible how the cracked earth rejects the very water meant to sustain it. Because the ecological foundation is crumbling, the focus of study shifts from greening the desert to identifying why these marginal lands lost their capacity to sustain life. Transition to the next level of inquiry requires examining the smaller components of the system. This leads to the question of how the roles of vital biological links, ranging from stabilizing plants to essential pollinators like bees, begin to change under such extreme environmental stress. The movement of the desert edge remains a constant physical reality as the landscape continues its slow transformation. 1/3 of all food consumed by humans every single day depends directly or indirectly on the pollination work performed by bees and similar species. These insects function as a foundational part of the global ecological infrastructure rather than merely existing as independent organisms. From almonds and apples to melons and leafy vegetables, the connection is absolute. Even the plants grown specifically to feed livestock rely on these tireless flights to reproduce. Why is their presence considered so critical to the stability of the planet? At first glance, the process seems like a simple biological routine, but in reality, bees determine whether the cycle of life can continue or if it will stall. It gets more complex further on. Bees do not create life itself, yet they act as the primary biological switch for its expansion. When these populations disappear, the resulting collapse does not arrive with the force of a sudden explosion or a loud catastrophe. Instead, the degradation unfolds quietly and often irreversibly across the landscape. One can notice how the absence of movement in the air precedes the thinning of the soil and the browning of the flora. However, when bees return to a region, the recovery of the environment is usually faster than most observers expect. The process is only gaining momentum. Wildflowers can reappear across a valley within a single growing season once pollination resumes. Seeds are dispersed farther than before, and isolated patches of green vegetation gradually reconnect into continuous, healthy corridors. This is the reason why scientists classify bees as biological indicators of environmental health. Where these insects thrive, ecosystems are functioning properly at every level. The equipment of nature operates at peak efficiency. Over 1,000 species of bees survive even in Nevada, which remains one of the hottest and driest states in the United States. Even in such harsh environments, their role as stabilizers does not change. They pollinate native plants and maintain the sparse but stable vegetation that keeps the desert floor from shifting. It is visible how their presence prevents the land from collapsing entirely into drifting sand by anchoring the root systems of desert flora. But this is just the beginning. Why did the local ecosystem become significantly more fragile in the early 2000s? During that period, bee populations began to decline sharply across the semi-arid landscapes of the region. It was not only the production of honey that vanished from the environment. Nevada reveals a critical technical truth about the natural world. Even at the extreme edge of survivability, these insects remain the primary force that keeps life from slipping out of balance. The material of the ecosystem is held together by their constant activity. Thus, the biological process concludes this phase, maintaining the equilibrium of the landscape. One central role for these insects allows a bold assumption to begin taking shape regarding the reclamation of desolate landscapes. Why is the bee considered a potential spark for life in places that are almost entirely dead? If these creatures can prevent harsh environments like Nevada or the Arava from collapsing completely, it is logical to assume they could serve as a biological catalyst. They are not viewed as a complete solution for global shifts, but rather as the initial trigger for an ecological chain reaction. One can notice how queen bees are collected from distant regions and kept in cold storage to slow their metabolism to a minimum. This ensures their survival as they are transported across seas and vast stretches of sand into the deep Sahara. The process is only gaining momentum. The goal does not involve turning the desert into lush grassland within a few years, which would be physically impossible. Instead, the introduction of bees allows young vegetation to avoid remaining isolated by giving plants a consistent chance to reproduce. It is visible how the insects move between rare flowering points, creating the first biological footholds necessary for long-term soil recovery. At first glance, the task seems impossible, but in reality, the survival of the ecosystem depends on these minute movements. Examples from around the world make this technical assumption less far-fetched. In the Arava Desert of Israel, bees have not only survived, but have become a vital foundation of modern desert agriculture. Amid dry and rocky terrain, beehives are placed directly in the fields to ensure maximum coverage. They pollinate crops with relentless mechanical consistency, which significantly increases total yields for the region. The equipment used to monitor these colonies operates around the clock, allowing areas once considered uncultivable to be transformed into major sources of agricultural production. It gets more complex further on. In this specific case, the bees do not green the desert through natural spread alone, but they allow humans to extract the maximum biological potential from what the arid land can support. This transformation turns the Sahara into the next logistical question. Because the Sahara is larger, harsher, and far more dangerous than the Arava, the scale of the operation must increase tenfold. One can notice the immense atmospheric pressure and heat that the colonies must withstand in such a vast territory. The camera glides along the edge of the dunes, where the first test sites are established, marking the boundary of the unknown. Everything only gets more complicated as the transition to the next level of environmental engineering begins. The desert remains a formidable barrier, yet the introduction of the catalyst marks the start of a measured change. The material for the next stage of the ecological chain is now in place. 35 degrees Celsius is the precise thermal threshold required for the internal stability of a beehive. Why is this specific temperature so critical for the colony's survival? The environment must remain within this range to prevent the collapse of the social structure, yet the Sahara Desert operates far beyond such biological boundaries. But in reality, the Sahara is fundamentally different from the landscapes of Nevada or the Arava, serving as a zone where every physiological limit is pushed to the breaking point. While bees possess a natural capacity to adapt to high temperatures, they cannot survive an environment of infinite heat. The struggle for survival becomes a mechanical process of constant energy expenditure. One can notice how the insects transform into living fans, beating their wings with high-frequency oscillations to generate cooling airflow. They must carry water back to the hive continuously to maintain the delicate balance of the interior. This relentless work consumes massive quantities of energy and only remains effective if the external temperature eventually subsides to a manageable level. In the Sahara, however, the thermal load does not retreat. One can notice the surface of the sand reaching temperatures that exceed 70 degrees Celsius. The atmosphere holds almost no moisture, and the primary danger lies in the persistence of the heat rather than its peak intensity. Even in the Nevada desert, where groundwater and sparse vegetation provide a biological buffer, researchers have documented the physical destruction of hives during long heat waves. The wax softens until it loses all structural integrity, causing the entire nest to collapse under its own weight and forcing the colony to flee. If such a failure occurs in a functioning ecosystem, the risk in the Sahara is exponentially greater because there is virtually no biological foundation to support life. Not even the most specialized species, such as the East African or Nubian bees, can survive on barren sand alone. Archaeological evidence from ancient bee colonies near the Kufra oases proves that life has existed in this region for thousands of years, but only in specific zones where water and moisture-retaining soil were present. Bees do not possess the mechanical or biological means to create these essential conditions. They do not generate water from the air, they do not transform silica sand into fertile soil, and they cannot restore an ecosystem that has already suffered a total foundational collapse. When confronted with the raw environment of the Sahara, the physical limits of these insects become unmistakably clear. Bees may eventually return to the desert, but only after the land has been mechanically and biologically prepared in advance. This realization shifts the technical focus toward a more practical and significant question. Since bees cannot serve as the initial starting point for restoration, one must identify the specific mechanisms or organisms that are quietly repairing the soil and water systems of the Sahara to allow life to return. Zero bees are required in the Sahara at this specific stage of ecological restoration. Why would an insect population be irrelevant to a desert expanse? It seems simple to assume that pollinators bring life, but in reality, they are a secondary result of a healthy ecosystem rather than its foundation. The desert requires something more fundamental, which is soil capable of holding moisture and water that remains stagnant long enough for biological processes to restart from the earth upward. Bees do not create these vital conditions. They only return to a region once such environmental stability already exists, and it is precisely along the southern perimeter of the Sahara, where the sand meets the Sahel, that humans have implemented a different strategy. This approach does not begin with the introduction of animals or the mass planting of flora, but starts by repairing the physical integrity of the land itself. From that singular strategic choice emerged the massive continental project known as Africa's Great Green Wall. 9,200,000 square kilometers is the approximate area currently covered by the Sahara Desert. This vast expanse is nearly the size of the United States and accounts for almost one-third of the entire African continent. More alarming is the observation that the desert is still actively expanding its borders. One can notice how the landscape shifts as the Sahara advances, yet the Sahel does not vanish in a single moment. It gradually loses its capacity to sustain human life through a slow degradation of resources. But this is just the beginning. The paradox is that the Sahel is not a land entirely devoid of precipitation. Each year, the region still experiences rainy seasons that are short in duration but extremely intense in volume. The problem lies elsewhere in the mechanical properties of the Earth. The soil has lost its physical capacity to absorb water through its surface layers. After decades of intensive overexploitation, heavy grazing by livestock, and prolonged periods of drought, the land surface has become compacted and sealed. It hardens until it resembles a layer of cement. It only looks obvious that rain would hydrate such a landscape. When the rain eventually falls, the water no longer infiltrates the parched soil, but instead rushes across the surface in a violent torrent. This creates devastating flash floods before the moisture vanishes entirely into the atmosphere or distant basins. The result is a deadly and repetitive vicious cycle. Drought weakens the soil structure, and then heavy rains accelerate the process of erosion. Fertile topsoil is washed away by the moving water, and with each passing rainy season, the land becomes even less capable of retaining any moisture. Desertification is therefore not merely a climate issue, but the total collapse of the soil-water system that once sustained life along the Saharan edge. It is visible how the Earth cracks and rejects the very liquid it needs to survive. Everything only gets more complicated as the cycle repeats. From this realization, the Great Green Wall did not start with the act of planting trees. It began with a different technical question altogether. How can the water be forced to stay in the ground before any form of life is invited to return? The process is only gaining momentum as engineers look toward the mechanics of the Earth. Molten heat and dry winds continue to batter the region, but the focus remains on the structural integrity of the dust. Thus, the transformation moves to the next phase of physical intervention. Billions of dollars in international aid have been poured into large-scale campaigns to plant billions of saplings across the Sahel for decades. Why do these massive ecological efforts fail so consistently? It seems like a simple matter of logistics to introduce greenery into the desert. But without a functional foundation, the young trees perish after only 1 or 2 rainy seasons, leaving the landscape as barren as before. Planting on dead soil is fundamentally flawed in its sequence. One can notice how the ground in these regions has already lost its physical structure and is nearly devoid of essential living microorganisms. This means the Earth has no capacity to retain water, even during peak precipitation. When the rain finally arrives, the water simply runs off the surface too quickly to penetrate the parched layers. But this is just the beginning. The process is only gaining momentum as the sun returns and surface temperatures soar. It is visible how moisture evaporates within hours under the intense heat. Under such harsh conditions, roots never have a chance to grow deep enough to reach a stable water source. Everything only gets more complicated when the lack of organic matter prevents the soil from cooling down. Installing a sophisticated machine on a collapsed foundation is the only way to describe the act of placing trees into dead soil. The core issue in the Sahel is not merely a shortage of visible greenery, but the total loss of the soil's ability to sustain life. If the physical and biological foundation is not repaired first, every subsequent effort can only ever be temporary. The equipment and labor involved in these campaigns provide no long-term solution without soil restoration. The process concludes this phase, opening the road to a more calculated approach to land management. 8,000 kilometers. This is the total distance across which the African Union initiated a massive restoration program in 2007, following a series of historical setbacks. Why did the project known as the Great Green Wall require such an enormous geographical span from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea in the east? At first glance, the task appears to be the construction of a single physical barrier against the desert. But without a localized approach that respects the specific ecology of over 20 participating nations, the project would fail to survive the harsh conditions of the Sahel Belt. The Great Green Wall is not a continuous, unbroken line of forestation, as many might assume. One can notice how the project instead functions as a vast mosaic-like network of diverse ecosystem restoration initiatives. It gets more complex further on. It only looks obvious that one should simply plant trees, but in reality, each region implements technical solutions specifically tailored to the unique chemical composition of the local soil and the precise levels of annual water availability. The equipment gradually prepares the terrain to support the livelihoods of the surrounding human communities. This is just the beginning. Because the core philosophy of this international endeavor remains strictly focused on ecological mechanics, the project avoids the mistake of forcing the landscape into an unnatural state. It does not attempt to make the desert green through artificial means. Instead, the process involves the careful repair of how the soil and water systems function together on a physical level. The process is only gaining momentum. Once the land restores its natural capacity to retain moisture, biological life begins to return through an automated natural sequence. It is visible how the water cycles stabilize first, creating a foundation for vegetation. Trees are not the starting point of this industrial-scale restoration, but rather the final technical outcome of a system that has been correctly repaired from the ground up. The material of the earth slowly transforms as the natural cycles take over their original functions. Transition to the next level occurs as the soil structure strengthens under the new environmental regime. Thus, the restoration reaches a stable state where the ecosystem can sustain itself without constant intervention. 4 countries, Senegal, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Mali, utilize a specific soil structure as the primary starting point for ecological restoration rather than planting trees directly. Why is this extremely simple half-moon pit preferred over more complex modern engineering? The decision to implement this specific geometry stems directly from the unique and aggressive behavior of precipitation within the Sahel region. Restoration begins with the earth itself. The rain in these territories does not descend in gentle soaking intervals, but instead arrives in short and violent bursts that immediately rush downslope across the arid surface. One can notice how a standard straight trench fails in this environment, as it merely channels the water away from the intended site like a high-speed gutter. A half-moon pit, characterized by its distinct curved shape and open end, intercepts surface runoff from multiple directions simultaneously. The process is only gaining momentum. It is visible how the crescent formation forces the liquid flow to decelerate, spread out across the depression, and eventually settle into the parched ground. The crescent shape naturally reduces water velocity without trapping the liquid excessively in one spot. But this is just the beginning. It is visible how the water does not accumulate into stagnant standing ponds, where the intense heat would cause it to evaporate within hours. Instead, the liquid lingers just long enough to infiltrate the deep layers of the soil profile, replenishing the underground moisture reserves. At first glance, the digging of these pits seems like a rudimentary manual task, but in reality, the design works in perfect synchronization with the local terrain and the force of gravity, rather than attempting to resist them. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale of the restoration increases across thousands of hectares. Because the structure relies on fundamental physical laws, it remains consistently effective in harsh climates where many more expensive and modern structures have historically failed. The equipment of the local farmers, often consisting of simple hand tools, gradually transforms the landscape into a series of organized catchments. Transition to the next level, the soil becomes saturated, creating a foundation that can finally support the growth of vegetation and the return of biodiversity to the Sahel. This simple intervention concludes the initial preparation of the land, allowing the restoration cycle to move into its next functional phase. 2 to 5 years is the approximate duration required for the biological transformation to become visible across the landscape. Why is such a lengthy period necessary for these ecological structures to manifest? The transition occurs in phases, as the newly established vegetation must first secure its position within the engineered pits. But this is just the beginning. Farmers sow specific varieties of drought-tolerant native grasses, such as andropogon or sancrus, directly into the prepared earth. One can notice how the seeds are distributed within the depressions to maximize their access to trapped moisture. These species are selected not for their immediate market value or economic yield, but strictly for their specialized ecological functions. The process is only gaining momentum. Deep and fibrous root systems characterize these grasses, serving as subterranean anchors for the vulnerable soil. These biological networks increase water infiltration rates and actively retain organic matter that would otherwise be swept away by the wind. At first glance, the planting seems like a simple agricultural task, but in reality, it is a calculated effort to modify the physical properties of the earth. Everything only gets more complicated. The equipment is not required for the next phase, as nature takes over the restorative work. Isolated and scattered patches of green grass begin to expand over the seasons. It is visible how these individual clusters gradually connect to form a continuous and protective ground cover across the previously barren terrain. Importantly, the return of life is not restricted to the sown grasses alone. As the moisture levels in the soil rise and the internal structure of the ground improves, native shrubs and trees start to regenerate without human intervention. The camera glides along the regenerating landscape where diverse flora emerges from the stabilized earth. Transition to the next level. Insects and small animals soon populate the area, followed by the reintroduction of grazing systems. One can notice how these elements integrate to transform what were once temporary oases into fully functioning and self-sustaining ecosystems. The process ensures the land is no longer surrounded by encroaching desert, but is instead part of a resilient biological chain. The material environment reaches a state of stability as the restoration phase concludes. Zero miracles are involved in the deliberate restoration of the Sahara Desert, as the process relies entirely on human engineering to repair the fractured foundations of terrestrial hydrology and soil structure. Why is the mechanical restoration of these ecological systems more effective than simple waiting? It only looks obvious that nature can heal itself. But once the land loses its fundamental ability to absorb and hold moisture, the surrounding ecosystem enters a terminal state of collapse that cannot be reversed by natural cycles alone. The restoration of this physical foundation acts as the primary catalyst, allowing biological life to re-establish its own equilibrium. One can notice how the dry earth, once treated with structural interventions, begins to stabilize under its own weight. Engineers implement specific techniques to ensure the ground can once again support vegetation. This is because the cycle of desertification creates a hard, impermeable crust that repels water like solid stone. But this is just the beginning. It seems simple to suggest that nature should regulate itself without any external assistance. However, in reality, the damage to the soil is often too deep for the local environment to overcome without a technical restart. Should humans continue to actively intervene in these processes through mechanical and chemical stabilization? Or is it better to step back and observe the natural pace of change? The equipment gradually moves across the arid landscape, reinforcing the terrain to prevent further erosion. The process is only gaining momentum as more regions are integrated into the recovery plan. Life begins to reappear in the wake of these interventions, moving through the restored zones as the soil density and moisture levels return to their functional parameters. Thus, the technical restoration of the land concludes its initial phase, allowing the ecosystem to transition into a period of autonomous growth.